Originally, my son was about 2 years old and he was not talking the way I expected him to be talking. So, like a diligent mom, I was Googling like crazy. And I encountered this condition called apraxia, childhood apraxia of speech. And I read this website and I said, that's it. That's what's going on with my son. This is it, right?
This is the Auto Community Podcast. All interviews presented on the Auto Community Podcast are designed to provide information and inspiration only. Guests of the podcast may present opinions and anecdotes that are solely their own. And as always, before beginning any treatment protocol, consult with your preferred medical provider. Hey everyone, it's Erin. Welcome to the Auto Community Podcast. Today's guest is no stranger to many of the moms out there, specifically mothers who have been struggling with their children with autism, hands and pandas. My guest today is Zoey O'Toole. She was the founder of the Thinking Moms Revolution for those of us moms who were looking for a light at the end of the tunnel. Her blog and website was very instrumental in helping us find that light, as well as so many of the tools that we eventually ended up using to help heal our children. She's also now the publisher liaison with the Children's Health Defense, who many of you are probably familiar with, as well as the co-author of Turtles All the Way Down, Vaccine Science and Myth, also co-edited by Mary Holland. So welcome, Zoey O'Toole. How are you?
Thank you. I'm good. I just want to correct a couple of tiny things. I was a co-founder of the Thinking Moms Revolution, and I did end up doing pretty much all of the editing on the website. So when people were interacting over there, they were usually interacting with me. So yes, if you were reading our blog, you were talking to me.
Yeah.
And I did not write Turtles All the Way Down. I just edited it. It was written by a group of Israeli authors who are anonymous for some very good reasons. And it was written in Hebrew to begin with. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to put out an English edition, and Mary Holland basically encountered them at a conference in Israel. And she figured out how to get to them, to talk to them about putting out an English edition. And she wanted to be doing the editing for them, but she obviously got busy as the president of CHD at that point in time. And so she brought me into the project.
That's so awesome. What an amazing story of collaboration too. So I love that.
I tell people to this day, Mary and I do not know the names of the authors, and they're just shocked. They assume we know somehow what their names are, but they're so anonymous that even we do not know who they are.
Very, very interesting. So let's kind of back up a little bit. So what brought you into this space originally?
Well, originally, my son was about 2 years old and he was not talking the way I expected him to be talking. So, like a diligent mom, I was Googling like crazy. And I encountered this condition called apraxia, childhood apraxia of speech. And I read this website and I said, that's it. That's what's going on with my son. This is it, right? So a friend of mine that I knew from AvuSoft, it was like a Facebook precursor in a way, where a lot of women were networking on this website. And it was kind of like a Yahoo groups or something. So people who got to know each other. And this person I had actually known in real life for a long time. So we knew each other. And she said, have you thought about apraxia one day, just offhand? And I said, yeah, that's what I think it is. So she said, well, I know some people who are dealing with apraxia. Would you want me to get in touch with them? And already, at that point in my life, I knew the benefit of networking, and particularly networking with other moms. And so I said, yes, of course, put me in touch. So they started telling me things to do for my son. And I thought they were going to advocate some kind of speech therapy. And mostly they were advocating biomedical treatments. They were advocating digestive enzymes. They were advocating anti-inflammatories, high-dose fish oil. They were advocating probiotics. So I started adding in these things one at a time. And as I gave them to him, I watched his speech explode. This kid was barely talking at all. And within 2 weeks of the digestive enzymes, he was putting together syllables into sentences. And I was blown away because he was taking speech with one of the best speech teachers, I think, around. He was the head of the department at Long Island University, I think, in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very, very good, but he was getting nowhere with him. I did these biomedical things. Suddenly he was talking. And then I did homeopathy and had huge gains. Sounds that were not coming into place at all dropped into place, one after another, within like a couple of months. I was blown away. So all of this stuff told me that the mainstream had no idea how to deal with this stuff, but the women I was talking to did. So the more networking I did, the more networking I wanted to do. And I ended up joining this group that got organized around a particular homeopath who was specializing in autism.
Mm-hmm.
So my son had apraxia, but a lot of the kids who had apraxia also had autism.
Right.
So there was a lot of overlap in the autism world and the apraxia world. And this particular group were using this particular homeopath, and we got to be very good friends. Started this Facebook group, and we were talking to each other every day. And one day, one of the members came to us and said, we should write a book. And we were all like, okay. She said, no, really, everybody write a chapter. So we got 24 people
mm-hmm.
who wrote a chapter for this book. And then we had to figure out how to get it published. And since I was the person in New York and Skyhorse was the place that seemed to be publishing books about autism, they said, oh, there's this thing tonight. You should go talk to Tony Lyons at Skyhorse. And I was, wait, what? So basically I did. I showed up at this thing and I asked some questions and I said, well, I belong to this organization called the Thinking Moms Revolution. And because that was what we had decided would be the title of our book. And we've started a website and we're doing a blog because someone said you need a platform to sell the books. So
Right.
we started a blog, right? And a couple of the women put together the website, and then they said, here, sign up, you're doing the blogs. And we started editing each other's stuff. And it turned out that I was the one who really liked to edit. It wasn't a chore for me. It was like, yes, give me your work. I will edit this, So that's basically how I got started doing this sort of thing. And the more I did it, the more I wanted to do it, the more I liked doing what I was doing. So it's practically what you would call a dream job for me to be working for CHD, doing in the book space, choosing books, helping to shape them, and promoting them too. Getting all this information out to the people who need it.
Right. It's really so interesting. I think it parallels my own journey as well, because, very similarly, like you were saying with apraxia and autism, I found that to be very much the case with PANS and PANDAS. So when my son first got diagnosed, there was hardly any information. This was 10 plus years ago on PANS and PANDAS. But where I was finding most of my information was the overlap with the parents who were doing biomedical interventions for their children with autism.
Bingo.
So, I think ultimately, I always say, all of these things are interconnected, they're interrelated. They're, neuroimmune dysfunction, gut-brain connection dysfunction, those types of disorders, and they just present differently from a symptomatic perspective. And, they're all virtually coming from very similar sources. So, which is why so many of the biomedical interventions work. And of course, I love your connection with homeopathy because we also had very similar experiences with homeopathy, which eventually led me to say, okay, I need to learn more about this and I need to figure out how I can help my own child. So that's so amazing. I love that so much. Okay. So you have the blog, you have the book. And then what led you to, at that point, really telling some of these other women's stories outside of your internal circle? Obviously, the book was, largely passed around at various meetings and things. I know that for a fact, but so I'm sure people approached you, but what was that journey like?
Well, it was a fascinating journey and a different sort of journey for everyone, because some people came to it more from the autism perspective and having gone to Autism One for years. But I was kind of new to that. So I came into that and I found that my natural curiosity was a really good asset for me, because I like to listen to what people say. And I was finding that most people were not listening to these people. And because these biomedical things and the homeopathy had been so helpful for my children, and I'm going to say children, not child, because I found in the process of working to help my son's apraxia, I found pandas and said, that's my daughter. Mm-hmm. So I started treating her for that at the same time, in the same ways, just like you were saying, and amazing things were happening there. Mm-hmm. So because these things were so successful for me in a way that mainstream medicine has never been, I did more listening than most people do. And it paid off in a big, big way. For me, there's just so much knowledge in the community that is not being adequately conveyed to people outside the community. Mm-hmm. So that's why I ended up getting so passionate about getting that information out to other people, because I see so many other kids suffering in similar ways. When it comes to pandas, you hear about the rage episodes, you hear about parents sometimes getting beaten up by their children because the kids can't control these rage episodes. And that's just very, very sad. So I want to help people change that sort of thing.
Yeah. 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 So interesting that on the journey, you also experienced something totally different with your daughter. And I think speaks volumes to this whole idea that, it's essentially this neuroimmune umbrella that we like to create different labels for.
Right.
But, it's essentially, like I said, all stemming from the same thing. So then what, I know Turtles All the Way Down is your newest endeavor. And what really compelled you to dive into the vaccine science? And I know that's a big part of the work with CHDs. So what was that journey like, and what really kind of lit the fire for that for you?
That's a really good question, because that predated all of this for me. And that turned out to be a very lucky thing, because when my daughter was about 12 months old, I ran across an article about vaccines, and it was in Mothering magazine. And I'm pretty sure it was in Mothering magazine. And it was the first time I ever went, oh, wait, you mean my kids might not need all these things? Or maybe it's not necessary for them to, or maybe it could even be a bad thing, So I read this article and I thought, maybe I should check into this before I get my daughter the next round, because she was going to get the MMR. And then people were, there were just little rumors about the Andy Wakefield thing and the MMR. So I didn't even research that particularly at that point in time. What I did was just research vaccines and the adverse events that were on record.
Right.
And I thought, whoa, there's a lot more on record than I ever realized. And the minute I saw that, I thought, I'm not going to do this next round or the round after that. And then at one point, I think I got talked into finishing the DTaP series, just to finish the DTaP series, because she already had them and tolerated them pretty well, apparently. But now I know that they certainly were not helpful for her. Mm-hmm. So that was when I stopped. And then my son came along when she was 7 years old. So he had never been vaccinated. Thank God, because he has the susceptibilities in spades.
Sure.
And I would have been in big trouble if I vaccinated him. So that's how I got started thinking about vaccination in the first place. And then what really sparked my interest on this, reading the science, was hearing about the vaccine debate when it comes to autism. So you'd hear, okay, there was this thing about mercury. Maybe mercury was a problem. So I started to read about mercury and oh, yeah, maybe mercury is a problem. And then I read evidence of harm, and I saw that they had done several different iterations of the same study. And the first iteration, which was the one that made sense, said that autism was way more common in the kids who got those early hepatitis B vaccines. And, okay, this is telling me something. And then the more I would read about that, the more I thought, there's something here. And then I would read about the mainstream saying, oh no, this study proves that vaccines don't cause autism. And they'd say it about the thimerosal study that we were just talking about. It didn't say that at all. When it was published, it was a neutral study. It didn't prove anything. Zero, zip. And yet people were saying, well, this means vaccines don't cause autism. Well, not only did it not mean that, the fact that the analysis was so bad and so designed to hide a signal, if there was one, told me, like little red lights going off all over the place.
Right.
I was an electrical engineer when I first graduated from college, and I knew all about signal to noise ratio. And the idea is, if you want to see if there's a signal there, you amplify the signal and you take down the noise. And there are ways to do that in epidemiological studies. And they weren't doing that. They were doing the opposite of that. That told me a heck of a lot. So every time a new mainstream media account came out about a new study, I would go read the study and I would see what it said and see if it matched what the media was saying about it. And it never did. Not once. So that told me something too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I read studies, I can't think of a particular example off the top of my head, but studies where the conclusion is actually completely antithetical to the research. And I'm like, how can they write this conclusion? And, I mean, the only logical explanation that I can come up with is, well, they're being paid to write a different conclusion. Science has been captured. And unfortunately, if you dig into the data, most often you'll find something different than what the conclusion is. And unfortunately, I can't fault the doctors who parrot some of this information because, they're busy. They're right. Exactly.
Yeah. They don't generally read the science either. They get told the bottom line. The conclusion is this, and this. So everything's fine.
Right.
Well, not if you drill down and you look at the data.
Right.
You look at the data, everything isn't fine.
Right.
It's very unfine.
Right. Yeah. So I'll reference Bobby Kennedy here when he asked him, what about your position on vaccines? Do you think that's a problem? And he said, show me where I got it wrong, which I think is so perfect. So talking about Turtles All the Way Down, what was in your mind, what was the revelation there? What was new? I know we've had a lot of things come out in the past in publishing, and, I know the Highwire does a great job of a lot of that as well, but what was new about this and what was unique about it that made you really feel like it needed to be published?
That's a great question too, because there are lots of books out there and a lot of this information was out there in different places. But what's great about this book, particularly now, because back when I was doing this research and learning about this for the first time, it was easier to find this information. Back in the old days, Google wasn't trying to censor the information you got, and you could find stuff on alternative health rather easily. Now it's considerably harder to find anything that criticizes vaccines online. So the first thing is that it consolidates all of this in one place for the person who's new to this. who has never approached this topic before. You get vaccine safety science from start to finish in this book. And that's a good thing. That helps make the journey shorter for most people. They don't have to do the kinds of research you had to do, I had to do, anybody who's been doing this for a decade or more had to do. So that is number one. The next thing is that this book is very systematic. It takes vaccine safety science from start to finish. Starts with the clinical trials that are done before approval. Then it moves on to adverse event reporting. Then it moves on to the epidemiological studies that are often done after a vaccine is released. And it basically takes you through the safety science that's supposed to be protecting children. And it shows the inadequacies at every step along the way. And it shows the inadequacies from a mainstream viewpoint. It actually uses CDC, Stanley Plotkin's vaccines. It uses the World Health Organization, all these mainstream sources to tell you this is what vaccine safety science should look like.
Right.
And then it takes you to the actual clinical trials and says, this is how they did it. Now, why did they do it this way if this is supposed to be the best way to do it?
Right.
And the only conclusion you can come up with in the long run, when you get this repeated deficiencies throughout every step of vaccine safety science, the only logical conclusion is they are deliberately doing this to cover up a very high rate of adverse events. It's not 1 in a million, like we're told. It's not even remotely close to that. It's more like 1 in 10. It has a really negative event. So if that's the case, then you got to start evaluating the risk to benefit ratio in a much different way than the way they've been doing it in the past. We literally don't know the vaccine safety profile of a single vaccine on the childhood schedule. Now, if we don't know the safety profile of one vaccine, we certainly don't know the safety profile of the combined effects on the schedule. So if that's the case, the likelihood is that we are doing much more harm than good with our vaccine schedule. And so that's the kind of thing that I want people to be able to get to understand in the course of reading one book, right? And that you really get it with this book. If you are a logical person, you cannot escape these conclusions reading this book.
Right. So does it go all the way back to some of the original vaccine trials, or what's the timeline for the book?
The idea of the book is, or the premise perhaps, or the beginning, the jumping off point is the Turtles All the Way Down. So Turtles All the Way Down is a story that scientists love to tell. It's about a scientist probably around the turn of the century, of the 20th century, giving a lecture on astronomy to an audience and talking about how the universe may have begun or the earth may have been created. And after the lecture, a little old lady comes up to the scientist and says, "Oh, it's a beautiful theory, but it's all wrong. You know, the earth rests on the back of a turtle or an elephant on top of a turtle," as some of the stories go. And then the scientist says, "Oh, it does. And what's under the turtle? Oh, another turtle. Okay, what's under that turtle? Why, my dear, it's turtles all the way down." So scientists love to tell the story because it makes them look like the rational, logical, scientific people dealing with the irrational, superstitious, often female critics of this sort of thing, right? So the premise of the book in this case is that if you look at the clinical trials for all of the vaccines on the childhood schedule, you see that all of them, and not one of them, is the vaccine compared to an inert placebo, which is the gold standard, right? the control group, supposedly, is given another vaccine. Or in some cases, the vaccine without the antigen, which means that you could be getting a hefty dose of an aluminum adjuvant, which is not even remotely a placebo. A placebo is supposed to be inert in the body. It's not supposed to create biological effects. But by definition, an aluminum adjuvant creates immunological effects. Right. So that's not a control. That's not even remotely a control. So in all of the things on the schedule right now, the clinical trials are compared to another vaccine or the vaccine without the antigen. So if it's compared to another vaccine, then the authors wanted to go see what about the other vaccine it's compared to. Say it's the DTaP. Okay, so that's the diphtheria, tetanus, and acellular pertussis. What did they compare it to? They compared it to the DTP, diphtheria, tetanus, and whole cell pertussis, right? Well, but the adverse events were about the same, so it's safe, right?
Right.
Then the DTP vaccines were not ever done in a placebo-controlled trials. That they were approved back in the 1940s, I believe, and there was a field trial, but they were not compared to a placebo. And that was a combination of diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus vaccines that had also not been compared to a placebo. So there, at no point along the line has there been a randomized controlled trial with comparison against a placebo. We do not know the safety profile for any of the diphtheria, pertussis, or tetanus vaccines, much less all together, much less those with the others on the schedule. So that's the whole turtles all the way down concept that it was based upon. So it does go back to the beginnings, at least in some way.
Sure.
It really goes back to the beginning with the last chapter, not the wrap-up chapter, but the chapter before that is a long chapter about polio. Because whenever you start criticizing vaccine, what do people say? They say, what about polio? Do you want to bring back the days of the iron lung? And of course, nobody wants to do that. But as it turns out, the history of polio doesn't look anything like what we've been told it looks like. This chapter on polio goes back to the history and goes back to the original accounts of polio outbreaks in the late 1800s. And they didn't look like we were told they looked like. And they were very unusual with respect to infectious disease, because normally infectious disease would circulate in cities.
Right.
Dirty cities where people were crowded together. And in the wintertime, when people didn't have vitamin D because of sunlight, and they didn't have fresh food, and children were gathered together in crowded classrooms. Right. That's when infectious disease would be rampant. When you were in a city, your children in the wintertime, all of these things were usually when outbreaks would really happen. Not the case for polio. They started out in the country in the summertime. So why was polio so different? Nobody could understand that at that point in time. And probably what it was some interaction of a virus and an environmental toxin like DDT or lead arsenate, which is the precursor to DDT. So we do know that kind of poisoning creates neurological effects that look like polio.
Right.
We also know that if people get that kind of poisoning and they get an enterovirus or a poliovirus, that can cause much more severe effects. So that's likely what was going on. And that's why it didn't behave like a regular infectious disease outbreak. But nobody talks about that. Nobody knows that. Nobody knows that the history of the polio vaccines doesn't really make sense with the historical facts about polio.
Yeah. So I think, in my view anyway, one of the reasons so many parents are, especially with children with autism, PANS, PANDAS, and various neuroimmune disorders, are really starting to wake up to this idea that perhaps introducing vaccines into their child's already, in most cases, overly active immune system is probably not a very good idea. And that's primarily because, we're seeing things like these kids having, doing really well with biomedical treatments, then all of a sudden introducing a vaccine and then they regress. And,
How many times I've heard that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think it is really important to have these conversations, to make them candid, to understand the science, to look at the data and really get to the point where, we can have the discussion. I think that's the biggest downfall of the scientific community, is this complete disregard for those who have been injured, and this idea that if you have a question at all about, hey, you know what, my kid has this, hyperimmune response. I just think maybe we should wait, or maybe we should not do this vaccine because I'm afraid that it might, interrupt their healing at this point, and to be completely dismissed by the doctors. And so I think that's, this book is very, very much needed. These conversations need to happen.
One of the good things about the book, too, is it gives specific questions to ask your pediatrician. I think it helps give parents guts that they might not have had to question their doctors. All right.
Right.
This is what you were told, but what about this? If you ask, what about this? And they can't give you an answer, that's an answer.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, and a lot of times the answer is one line, like they're safe and effective. They've been proven safe and effective. And I think that does a lot of science, the large body of science, it does them a disservice, because unfortunately, as we've seen with everything going on with COVID, we're seeing now these spikes in reports to, adverse event reports to VAERS, and incredible.
Yeah.
And I think more and more people are starting to question, wait a minute.
That's been one of the things that has been so good about the timing of this book, because a lot of people got injured from the COVID vaccine, and a lot of other people who don't have overt or obvious injuries got the vaccines, sometimes 1, 2, maybe even more boosters, and got COVID anyway. So that right there, they were told that if they got vaccinated, they weren't going to get COVID and they were going to be fine. And then some people had all the vaccines and then got nasty cases of COVID. So immediately when that happens, people should be questioning. Not everybody does question when that happens. Some people go right to the, thank God I got vaccinated because it would have been so much worse. And yet they're seeing their unvaccinated friends not having it any worse than they are. So that if they really are paying attention, they're seeing, wait a sec, this vaccine really didn't do anything. And for some people got really sick when they got vaccinated, even if they didn't have an obvious injury. It was like having a case of COVID.
Right.
So people are starting to think, wait a minute, were we snowed? So the minute you get people thinking, were we snowed? Then their minds are a little more open.
Mm-hmm.
And as that was happening, we had doctors who were starting to confront the untruths they were being told about ivermectin, about hydroxychloroquine, about the vaccines. So there were doctors, pretty mainstream doctors, who were saying, wait a minute, this is not adding up. You're telling us this, but this is really true. So why is that happening? So they started questioning, and they got a lot of other people questioning. And now that they're questioning that, they're starting to question the childhood schedule as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And back in the beginning, they kept saying, almost all of them were saying, I'm not anti-vaccine, but, or I'm not, I believe in the childhood schedule. People should get all the childhood vaccines. But now these same doctors, Pierre Corey, Paul Merrick, Ryan Cole, Robert Malone, they're all reading turtles all the way down, learning about how this stuff has been going on for decades with vaccine science, and they're all tweeting or writing Substack articles or doing interviews that say, I would no longer vaccinate my children. I'm sorry I vaccinated my children because I found out what a scam it is. I had no idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And these are well-known doctors who were so mainstream and so trusted. And Pierre Corey, God love him. He says, we were taught almost nothing. And then we arrogantly tell people what they should do. And he basically said, I'm sorry I did any of that.
Right. Right. One of the things that I think has always been somewhat controversial is the fact that so many of the vaccines now are all combinations. And, even new vaccines coming to the market, most of them are combinations of some kind of a thing. And not only that, but there's this whole idea that we need to vaccinate for things that are not really necessarily infectious disease, like, the HPV vaccine. Although HPV is contagious, they're saying that it's to prevent cervical cancers. But, there's not a definitive, straight line between HPV and cervical cancer. So I know this is a loaded question, but has there ever been clinical trials on some of these vaccines in singular form, or have they always been trialed as combinations?
Well, they did do some form of clinical trial back in the beginning with the tetanus and the diphtheria and the pertussis, but they weren't randomized controlled trials like a phase 3 trial is supposed to be these days. Like the FDA is only supposed to be approving drugs and biologics after they've been shown safe and effective in phase 3 clinical trials. And they should be randomized controlled trials with an inert placebo, but they're not. And they never were. There have been a few randomized controlled trials with saline placebos globally in other countries with other versions of vaccines, but in this country, no.
And I have to wonder who funded those.
Yeah, I think in some cases it was with agencies that, the health agencies that were running the countries that were doing them were more conscientious than the FDA about this. Because at this point in time, at least, the FDA is a captured agency. They much of their operating budget comes from the pharmaceutical companies they're supposed to be regulating.
Right.
And if that's the case, then how do you keep the regulation honest?
Right. Right.
How do you keep them working for the citizens rather than the corporations that are paying their salaries? It's pretty much impossible to do.
So what, in your view, would be the linchpin that finally brings all of this to light? Like, is it going through and restructuring the FDA or the CDC? Is it education of our, boots on the ground, the doctors, the pediatricians administering vaccines?
I don't think we're going to get the doctors to revolt en masse.
Yeah.
Because they've got too much time and energy and money invested in their medical education.
Right.
So they can't just go against all that without a huge, it's like there's a huge activation energy to it. You have to put so much energy into this thing that it's not going to happen on a big scale.
Right.
It happens on an individual level and for the most part, the doctors who've done the questioning have watched a child regress, have watched someone react very badly to a vaccine. That's the thing that made them question. And they are, for the most part, more honest with themselves than average doctors. Sure. So it takes some kinds of characteristics that not every doctor has. Not every doctor is curious enough. Not every doctor is interested enough in drilling down to what's really happening here. So I don't think we're going to get that to happen. what I think we could get to have happen, and what I'm hoping that this book eventually helps to create, is enough parents who say, this is insane. I'm not going to do what you're recommending me to do. And if you get enough parents, and I think that we were getting close to that when COVID happened, because you would see surveys of parents of children. So parents of children under 18 at one point, sometime in the last decade, about 30% of them believe vaccines caused autism. And that was much higher than the general population.
Right.
30% is a good chunk.
Yeah.
So even if those 30% were not vaccinating, they were in the mental space where they might consider it. Or they might be tipped over. So
Right.
that's 30%. You get to 50%. It's only 20% more, and you've got a majority. And doesn't take that long necessarily to get from 30 to 50 if you've got a sudden jolt of information out there. So that's what, if parents really read this book with an open mind, they're going to stop vaccinating because they're going to see that there's just no science behind it.
Right.
And if they do that in enough numbers, that's going to change something.
Yeah. And I do think, what went on with COVID, whether you want to go into, was it a bioweapon? Was it, this or that? You don't even have to go there because, so many people were so affected by either COVID itself or the restrictions from COVID, and I mentioned this the other day was, especially parents with children with autism were lacking services and, impoverished families, impoverished families, kids were going without food. Like so many people were so widely affected that, you can't not pay attention. Right. And I think it was, I don't know the exact statistic at this point, but I know that the uptake of the COVID vaccines, for example, was significantly lower by the third round.
Yep.
And I think that's huge because I think it was somewhere in the ballpark of 10%.
I believe I heard somewhere 15 or 18.
Okay.
Yeah, low.
Yeah. So very low when you're considering the fact that, supposedly 70% of the population was for vaccinating, right? So I do think the conversations are changing. I do think parents have lost trust and faith in the medical community in a major way. And that's unfortunate because there are many really great doctors out there. And I guess what my hope and my takeaway from all of this is that, we can at least just sit across the table and have these conversations because so often it's, the immediate, oh, well, you're just an anti-vaxxer. So, you don't know this or you don't know that. And there's no honor of any kind of open dialogue about it. Right. And
that's a big point in the book, actually, is that if people were being intellectually honest, we could have this discussion. Right. We could ask, why does my child need all of these vaccines?
Right.
But you can't even ask questions like that without being labeled an anti-vaxxer, which is insane.
Right.
We know that antibiotics are overprescribed, right? Every mainstream source will tell you antibiotics are overprescribed. They're still overprescribed.
Right.
Everyone knows they are overprescribed and that is turning out to have a negative effect on the microbiome, which is having a negative effect on people's health. We're allowed to talk about that.
Right.
Why aren't we allowed to talk about overvaccination?
Right. Exactly. So what would be your advice to parents who are struggling, to people who are struggling in general with maybe some of the divisiveness within their own families? How would you advise someone to maybe present the book to them or to perhaps slide in some information that might open the door?
One thing I am hearing from a lot of people who are saying that they're buying copies of the book for their family members and
Mhm.
really hoping that they read them.
Right.
And I think the best thing to get people to have an honest, open conversation is to try very, very hard not to take anything someone is saying personally. They're parroting what the media is telling them. The media is telling them that you're a crazy psycho conspiracy theorist. So that's where they're starting from. You know that's not true. So don't take it personally. Just say, okay, I get that that's where you're coming from, but I have some serious questions. Now, I would love it if you would just read the first chapter of this book. Just read the first chapter and then let's discuss it. Okay? If you read that chapter, I would be delighted to have the conversation you want to have.
Yeah,
And
I think
then you're basically telling them, I'm willing to hear what you have to say, but you have to hear my side too.
right. Right.
And if you get them to do that, they're going to change their minds.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's brilliant. And ultimately that's, I think, what many of us have been saying for so many years is, can we just have a conversation?
Yeah. Yeah. The nice thing is that the authors of this book made that chapter available for free to anyone. So that chapter alone can change a lot of minds. Once you know that none of the vaccines on the childhood schedule have been tested in a randomized controlled trial against a placebo, that starts to open your mind. And that alone has blown a lot of doctors' minds because they really have no idea.
Sure. Sure. So on that note, we're coming to the end of our time. And I would love for people to know, number one, where they can buy the book, and number two, where they can access that first chapter.
Well, the authors decided that they wanted to self-publish like they did in Israel. So it is available only on Amazon and Jeremy Hammond's website, because he's decided to sell it for us as well. So if you're going to look on Amazon, Google Turtles All the Way Down, but make sure you add at least the word vaccine, because there is a novel of the same name that will come up, and that will probably be your first result. But if you put the word vaccine on, and if you particularly do the subtitle of Vaccine Science and Myth, you'll get to the book. Soft cover is white with blue turtles on it. It's kind of cute, and you'll know you're in the right place. And so that's where you can get the book. I don't have the link offhand for the first chapter, but
No.
I do.
So we'll go ahead and put that in the show notes for everybody listening.
I can send that to you.
Yeah, that would be great. So
Okay.
anyway, Zoey, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. I do hope that we can continue to shift some minds here and get people critically thinking. It's so important in the world that we live in today, especially.
I agree.
Any parting words?
No, just thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting the conversation.
Absolutely. Everybody take care. We'll see you next time.